The court will now be presented with a verdict given by Associate Chief Justice Stella Harris and Justice Rogan McClendon determining the fate of the defendant Herman Goering and the counts presented against him.
On count one of the indictment, the common plan or conspiracy, we find the defendant Herman Wilhelm Goering guilty. On count two of the indictment, crimes against the peace, we find the defendant Herman Wilhelm Goering guilty.
On count three of the indictment, war crimes, we find defendant Herman Wilhelm Goering guilty. On count four of the indictment, crimes against humanity, we find the defendant Herman Wilhelm Goering guilty.
We, the tribunal, sentence Herman Wilhelm Goering to the death penalty.
The court will now be presented with a verdict given by Justice Nissa Ahmed and Justice Ula Chacho, determining the fate of the defendant Rudolph Hess and the counts presented against him.
The tribunal was persuaded by the arguments of the prosecution and the evidence submitted that Rudolph Hess is guilty of count one conspiracy. While we were reviewing the evidence given to us by both prosecution and defense, we have come to the conclusion that Rudolph Hess is guilty of count two, crimes against peace.
Additionally, after reviewing the evidence and arguments presented by both sides, we, the tribunal, have come to the conclusion that Rudolph Hess is also guilty of count four, crimes against humanity. And we, the court, sentence Rudolph Hess to life in prison.
Attorneys can answer. The court will now be presented with a verdict given by Justice Kinsey Irwin determining the fate of the defendant Carl Dernitz and the counts presented against him.
On behalf of the tribunal, we find defendant Carl Dernitz not guilty under indictment one, common plan and conspiracy, guilty under indictment two, crimes against peace, and guilty under indictment three, war crimes. We hereby sentence Carl Dernitz to 50 years.
The court will now be presented with a verdict from Justice Charlie Leonard determining the fate of the defendant Eric Rader and the counts presented against him.
Eric Rader was charged with counts 1, 2, and 3. The tribunal finds Eric Rader not guilty of count 1, conspiracy. The tribunal finds Eric Rader not guilty of count 2, crimes against the peace. Finally, the tribunal finds Eric Rader guilty of count 3, war crimes. The International Military Tribunal sentences Eric Rader to 20 years.
The court will now be presented with a verdict given by Justice Abel Horwitz determining the fate of the defendant Balder von Schirra and the counts presented against him.
On behalf of the tribunal, on count one conspiracy, we found the defendant Balder von Schirra guilty. On count three, war crimes, we found the defendant guilty. And on count four, crimes against humanity, we found the defendant not guilty. We hereby sentence Schirra to 25 years in prison.
The court will now be presented with a verdict from Associate Chief Justice Lauren Allman determining the fate of the defendant Julius Streicher and the counts presented against him.
We, the tribunal, find Julius Streicher guilty on count four. The tribunal was persuaded by the arguments of the prosecution and the evidence submitted that the defendant is guilty of crimes against humanity. Streicher vandalized synagogues, abused Jewish people, persecuted Jews, in his works in Der Stürmer that had enough influence to impact the citizens of Germany. Therefore, he committed inhumane acts on religious grounds. In conclusion, the tribunal sentences Julius Streicher to 30 years imprisonment.
My fellow Chief Justice, Sophie Schermacher, will now close out our IMT mock trial.
Good evening. I am Chief Justice Sophie Schermacher. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my gratitude to all of you who worked tirelessly to make this trial happen. To my classmates, your research, your writing, your passion was evident in the presentations of your arguments and verdicts. To the families, thank you for your support and advice as we sought to learn more about international law. And most importantly, thank you to our teachers. You have guided us through the intricacies of the international military tribunals and helped us to navigate difficult and dire moments in history. We couldn't have done it without your guidance. The Nuremberg trials have proven to be an influential part of today's international legal system, how we view human rights, and how we seek to hold each other accountable. When we finish this trial, we have by no means finished the discussion around hate. We have by no means finished the discussion around propaganda. Despite the often quoted words of George Santayana, author of the book, The Life of Reason, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We have seen numerous episodes in far more recent history, post-1945, where a charismatic leader preys on those questioning their universe of obligation. That dictator has stepped in and taken over the minds and the souls of many, ultimately forcing hate-filled propaganda into communities, tearing apart families, destroying lives. But history does not have to repeat. It does not have to repeat. Rabbi Ilan Emanuel of Congregation Beth Israel, Texas, said in 2019 that each of us can learn to see the signs of prejudice and hatred, to stand up to the inhumanity of human beings towards those who are different, to be upstanders, not bystanders in our own time. It is important to understand the consequences of the devastating events of the Holocaust and World War II, and to recognize the horrors of genocide so that we can prevent these circumstances from unfolding again. Although we have learned many crucial lessons from these occurrences, it is important to acknowledge the continuing persecution and hate of minority groups that have proven to be etched deeper in humanity than believed. Many countries have been affected by brutal dictators, such as during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, where approximately 800,000 people, 1/10 of the population, were killed in about 100 days by the Hutu group. Another country suffering the effects of genocide was in Sudan, where since 2003, approximately 400,000 people were killed by a government-sponsored militia group, the Janjaweed. Former President George W. Bush and the US Congress have recognized the Sudan genocide and referred to it as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. The evolution of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is the strongest and most relevant outcome from the Nuremberg era, all the way to the present day when the Janjaweed was tried by the ICC. The leader of the Janjaweed was tried on war crimes and crimes against humanity, 2 international military tribunal indictments used at the Nuremberg trial, which exhibits lasting ramifications from the Nuremberg Charter. Although the verdicts of the Janjaweed trial have not been concluded, it became evident that the influences of the past international military tribunals are still important to the International Court. The legacy created by the Nuremberg trials is multi-layered, yet another reason why the events of World War II are impossible to forget. The Nuremberg trials created a foundation for the International Criminal Court and were a benchmark for international trials to come. However, following the trials, the concept of victor's justice became commonplace amongst trials involving indictments similar to those in Nuremberg, most notably crimes against humanity. The concept of victor's justice argued against one of the foremost tenets of the Nuremberg trials, which is in the article of ensuring a fair trial for all. The Allied troops committed crimes that would most certainly fall into the indictments used at Nuremberg, the internment of Japanese Americans on American soil following Pearl Harbor, as well as the use of atomic bombs at the end of World War II. Allied nations, including the United States, served no major punishments, save for national apologies decades later. So here we stand in the hallowed halls of justice, considering how to rule on evidence of mass murder, genocide, and crimes against humanity. We weigh the concepts of nationalism, colonialism, and racism. We deconstructed the etymology of genocide, defined by Raphael Lemkin as the intentional destruction of ethnic or national groups. We tested and unpacked international laws. Would those laws that were created at The Hague in the 1890s hold steady amongst the atrocities of World War II and the men tried here today? And would international law scholars have the ability to hold these laws and conventions accountable amongst modern instances of genocide across the globe? While together we have made an attempt to answer these very difficult questions, We can only hope that future generations seek to build a society fueled by acceptance and inclusion rather than hate, perhaps one day rendering such tribunals unnecessary. Now, we lean on the time-tested charters and conventions to offer a fair and just verdict each and every time. Thank you.
All right, I'll keep this very short because it's been a long day. Thank you to the justices. Thank you to the attorneys. Thank you to the defendants. Thank you to the families. Thank you to Mr. Cruz for being my partner in crime, going on 4 years now. Most of all, thank you to Ms. Dorr for being the reason that years in and 45 years more. What do you think? Yes. Have a wonderful night. And we'll see you all tomorrow, bright and early at school. Thank you all again.